Chapter 4. The Establishment of the Muslim State. To keep this channel going, we need your support. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel. Chapter 4, Part 1. The death of Ali at the hands of the Kharijis and the rise of Muawiyah to the Caliphate marks the end of the era commonly referred to as the rightly guided caliphs. The nature of Muslim government and society fundamentally changed during the 19 years of Muawiyah's rule from 661 to 680. Coming to power at a time when disunity and chaos reigned from Egypt to Iran. Muawiyah's political skill and competence helped prevent the Muslim world from falling into total anarchy, from which it may never have risen. Yet at the same time, some of his policies and actions were controversial and formed the basis for some of the biggest divisions in the Muslim world today. His reign marks the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphate, when succession to the position became hereditary and stayed in the Umayyad family until 750. When it was replaced by another old family of Mecca, the Abbasids. Muawiyah. Despite the attempts at arbitration, a real solution to the dispute between Ali and Muawiyah never took shape. And the last years of Ali's caliphate were marked by de facto division between the realms of Muawiyah and Ali. With the death of Ali, however, Muawiyah was free to extend his control over the areas formerly loyal to Ali and reunify the Muslim world under his command. Indeed, he was probably the only man at the time that had enough support to manage such a monumental task. He was incredibly popular in Syria, a province he had looked after as governor for 20 years before the start of his caliphate, and Syrian army formed the backbone of his military. He was not without enemies, however, particularly in Iraq, where popular opinion was in favor of the caliphate being inherited by Ali's son, Hassan. Ever the pragmatic statesman, Muawiyah had no desire to plunge the Muslim world into further warfare over leadership. So instead of mobilizing the army to violently crush the opposition, he negotiated a deal with Ali's son, in which Hassan would give up any claims to leadership and retire to a life of worship and scholarship in Mecca. Desire among some for rule by the house of Ali remained, although under the surface, and it never materialized into a real threat to the reign of Muawiyah. The Dome of the Rock Mosque was built in the late 690s as part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex in Jerusalem. Its design is largely Byzantine, and was partly engineered by Christians. The Caliph also relied upon negotiation and deal-making with other potential opponents. In many ways, Muawiyah ruled like an Arab tribal leader from pre-Islamic Arabia, using family relations, an unwritten code of honor and gifts to get his way politically. Having been a youth in Mecca who saw how his father led Quraysh, these old traditions were no doubt ingrained in his political persona. At the same time, however, Muawiyah began to change the caliphate into something new, a monarchy. He was the first caliph to sit on a throne, and the first to pray in an enclosed area in the mosque, protecting him from possible assassins. He no longer followed in the modest and simple footsteps of the first four caliphs. Instead, royalty and court culture became a part of the caliphate as it had been part of the Roman and Sassanid empires. For the first 30 years after the death of the Prophet, the caliph was simply a first among equals, and numerous anecdotes survive of the asceticism of those first four leaders, such as Umar being mistaken for a commoner or refusing the service of bodyguards. Muawiyah was the bridge between the simple caliphate that came before him and the monarchy that succeeded him. He would walk in the markets of Damascus in his patched clothing as enormous and elaborate mosques were built by his architects. As part of his overall program to de-emphasize political divisions among Muslims, Muawiyah chose to focus on expanding the borders of the caliphate. Reminiscent of Umar, who focused on outward expansion after the infighting of the wars of apostasy, Muawiyah sent armies to continue the war against the Byzantine Empire by land and sea. The important islands of Rhodes and Crete in the Aegean Sea were occupied by the navy first established under Uthman. Buoyed by these victories, the Muslim armies were, for the first time, able to lay siege of the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. The legendary city had been a prize since the earliest days of Islam, when the Prophet promised that eventually a Muslim army would conquer that distant and seemingly impenetrable city. As Muslim armies approached the city for the first time in 674, fulfilling that promise seemed to be within reach. From 674 to 678, the Umayyad armies laid siege to the city's massive walls, but lacked the manpower or technology to conquer the city. Among the casualties of the siege was the elderly Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, a notable companion of the Prophet who lodged Muhammad in his home when he arrived in Medina. He was buried near the walls of Constantinople, and almost 800 years later would become a mythic legend for the Ottoman armies that eventually managed to overcome Constantinople's walls. Expansion also continued in North Africa, where the Byzantines still had control west of modern Libya. The fringes of Umayyad-controlled land west of Egypt were governed by Uqba ibn Nafi, another companion originally from Mecca. In 670, he was ordered to advance into Byzantine Africa in conjunction with the ongoing advances into Byzantine territory in the Aegean. Uqba's army consisted of 10,000 Arab horsemen who were aided by huge numbers of local Berbers who had recently converted to Islam. Because of the Byzantine preoccupation with other fronts, Uqba was able to advance unchallenged into modern Tunisia, where he established the garrison city of Kairouan. The main threat ended up not being the Byzantine forces, but the local Berbers who had to be slowly subdued before any more advances towards the west could be embarked upon. Following a short period from 675 to 680 during which Uqba was replaced as governor of Ifriqiya, which is the province of Africa, Uqba continued his westward raids. By 680 the Umayyad armies were well established enough in North Africa to embark on serious conquests across modern Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, collectively known as the Maghreb. To the Atlantic Ocean. Uqba's role in these conquests would raise him to a legendary status for North Africa's Muslim population. After leaving Kairouan in 680, Uqba's army marched generally unopposed through the desert plateau south of the coastal mountain ranges that run along the Mediterranean. Advancing from one Byzantine outpost to the next, Uqba's army was able to quickly annex hundreds of kilometers of territory along the coast with relative ease. Even as disunity and civil wars raged in the heartland of the Islamic Empire. One possible explanation for this seemingly miraculous conquest was linguistic, cultural and religious division between the Berbers of North Africa and the Byzantine rulers. The Byzantines who ruled over North Africa could not be more different from the Berbers under their control. The Berbers were a desert people, closer to the Arab nomads who arrived in the 600s than the urban Latins and Greeks who had administered the area for centuries. Their language shared no history with the Greek used in administration, and few Berbers went out of their way to learn the language of their governors. The lack of common cultural traits meant a constant social divide between the two, and examples of full assimilation of the Berbers into Roman Byzantine society are scarce. Religion, however, seems to be a larger factor that led to Berber support for the Arab Muslim armies. Early Islamic accounts speak of entire tribes of Berbers converting to Islam immediately upon arrival. There were certainly divides between North Africans and the Byzantines on issues within Christianity. The main issue was the nature of divinity and humanity. Separatist Christian movements, such as Arianism and Donatism, openly disputed the official orthodoxy promoted by the Byzantines and may well have caused North Africans to lean closer to Islam. But even if they did not all convert immediately, as early chroniclers claim, the Berbers certainly had practical reasons to rise up against the Byzantines in conjunction with arriving Muslim armies. Thus it was possible for Uqba's army to continue gaining momentum as it did through the early 680s until they were able to push into modern Morocco and to the shores of the Atlantic. His legendary words when he rode his horse into the crashing waves of the ocean hint at the deeply religious nature of these conquests. "O Lord, if the sea did not stop me, I would go through the lands like Alexander the Great, defending your faith and fighting the unbelievers." Whether or not he actually said those words is not as important as the role that heroic image would play in the minds of generations of military leaders that would rise out of the Islamic Maghreb.